This podcast is part of E2C Network, where we share the whole Auburn experience.
Hello and welcome to War Horses, the only college equestrian podcast that's packed and ready to head down to the NCEA tournament. I am your host, Auburn Elvis. Let's talk about some college equestrian. So we don't have any meets to recap. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip the golden score sheet. We're going to skip the rankings because the rankings don't matter anymore. It's just what you do in the ring. So let's take a look at our final meet preview. Okay, so the single discipline tournament isn't going to start till Friday, but I'm going to go ahead and do that one first. For a while this season, it looked like it was just going to be Lynchburg and Sweetbriar, but then Dartmouth upset Sweetbriar at home and showed us that the top two teams were vulnerable. You fast forward a few months, and now we have us a single discipline tournament with a little bit of intrigue. Now, Lynchburg is the top seed. They're really good. They're the two-time defending national champs, and they have looked slightly better than our number 2 team, Sweetbriar. Now, the Vixens are also loaded with talent, but we have seen a couple of times when teams have been able to keep things closer with them than they should have, and if that continues, then who knows what's going to happen. At number 3, we have Dartmouth. As I mentioned, they became the first single discipline team in ages to beat one of those big two in the sport. They are the dark horse contender for the title here, and coming in at number 4 seed is Swanee. The Tigers look pretty good in their conference tournament, even though they did get that loss. But if they can get hot, who knows? Maybe they could shock the world. So now let's jump right on into the stats and some predictions and see what the stats suggest. In semifinal number 1, we have Swanee versus Lynchburg. According to the stats, I think Fences is going to go 4-1 for the Hornets, and Flat will also go 4-1 for the Hornets. If that happens, we're looking at an 8-2 win for Lynchburg. Semifinal 2 is between Dartmouth and Sweetbriar, and I'm really excited about this rematch. Can the Green get an upset at a neutral site? Let's see what the stats say. It looks like Sweetbriar would win Fences 4-1, and that the Vixens would also take Flat 3-2. If that happens, we're looking at a 7-3 victory for Sweetbriar. So assuming that does happen, we would have a very familiar Sweetbriar and Lynchburg final, and in that, I think the edge would go to the Hornets. The stats say Fences would go 3-2 for Lynchburg, and that the Flat would go 3-1 for Lynchburg, making the final score a 6-3 win and another national championship for Lynchburg. But again, that's just based off of the stats, and the stats only take into account the past, and we're talking about the future, so we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. If a team doesn't ride well, then that opens the door for the other team, and yeah, we'll just see how that goes down in the single discipline tournament. Now, in the dual discipline tournament, that same theory still applies. You got to ride your best every day, or, you may be done. This is a very even field this year, and any of these 8 teams can win their first round meet. If the top teams try to take a day off, they may be taking more than a day off. So who are these top teams, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at them. In quarterfinal number 1, we will pit number 8 UC Davis against number 1 TCU. Coming into this, TCU is having their best season ever, but they have stumbled a bit in the past few weeks. They had that road loss at SMU, and then a narrow win over Baylor, and then a tight loss to Oklahoma State in the Big 12 tournament. That's not exactly what you want this time of year. For UC Davis, they have a fair amount of losses early in the season. They kind of made up for that by keeping every loss close, except for that first one, which was a road meet at Auburn. Also, the Aggies put together a very good run through the ECAC tournament, and that propelled them up to the final spot that got an invitation to Ocala. So TCU better look out. I'm going to tell you the numbers, and they're based on the stats, but if TCU keeps riding like they have recently, then the stats might be a little wrong. So let's look at these. I think Fences goes 3-1 for UC Davis. TCU is not strong in fences, so this is probably their Achilles heel. On the flat, I think that goes 3-2 for UC Davis. At this point, things would be looking good for UC Davis. But then we got to look at Western, and here's where TCU starts, really asserting their dominance. Horsemanship would probably go 4-1 for TCU, and I think reining would go 3-2 for TCU as well. Add all that up, and we're looking at a 10-8 TCU victory. Okay, quarterfinal number 2 is number 5 Georgia versus number 8 Texas A&M. These two teams split in the regular season meets. They did not meet each other in the SEC tournament, but overall in the season, Texas A&M looked a little bit sharper overall, but I think these are very evenly matched teams regardless of their records. According to the stats, we would expect Fences to go 3-2 for Georgia, expect Flat to go 3-2 for Georgia, Horsemanship looks to go 3-1 for Texas A&M, and reining should go 3-2 for Texas A&M. If all that happens, we're looking at a 10-9 win for Texas A&M. But I tell you, if they have one or two slip-ups by A&M, Georgia could take this meet. It's very close. Now over we go to quarterfinal number 3 between number 6 Oklahoma State and number 3 Auburn. These teams have similar records and finished their seasons in similar ways. Both of them rode through their respective tournaments and claimed upset conference titles again this year. So let's take a look at the numbers between these two teams. In fences, Auburn is really good here. They got the number 1 fences team in the nation going up against the Cowgirls, who are about the number 4 fences team. I think fences goes 3-2 for Auburn. In flat, Oklahoma State has the number 2 flat squad, and Auburn is down at about number 7. So I think this event goes 3-1 for Oklahoma State. In horsemanship, Auburn has a big advantage here on paper. The Tigers sport the nation's second best horsemanship group, whereas Oklahoma State is 5th best. I think that translates into a 3-1 win for Auburn. And on we go to reining. Here the teams are very evenly matched. Auburn is the 6th best reigning team. Oklahoma State is the 5th best, so very close. I think Oklahoma State would take this one 3-2. So if all that ends up happening, we're looking at a 9-9 tie, and I would probably give the tiebreaker to Auburn in this one. So on we go to quarterfinal number 4 between number 7 South Carolina and number 2 SMU. These two teams started out their seasons very close to one another, but then the grind of the SEC sort of wore down the Gamecocks. Meanwhile, the Mustangs seemed to get better as the season went on. They ended with that big home defeat of TCU. They did not have a conference tournament, so they didn't get that chance to hone their skills. But still, they are probably a trendy favorite to win this whole tournament. Like I said, if they come out rusty, though, then they might get upset. But let's take a look at what the stats say. In fences, I think that goes 3-2 for SMU. I think flat goes 3-2 for SMU. In horsemanship, I think that goes 3-1 for SMU. And in reining, that goes 3-2 for SMU. If all that happens, I think we're looking at a 12-7 win for SMU. So on we go to the semifinal round. Now the stats suggest that we're going to have Texas A&M versus TCU. If that happens, I think that would go 3-2 for Texas A&M. But we could have Georgia in that semifinal, and if that happens, I think it would go 4-1 in fences in favor of Georgia over TCU. So on the flat, I think that would be a 2-2 draw for Texas A&M and TCU. But if Georgia is in that, I think the Bulldogs would actually win that 3-2 or maybe even 4-1. Over we go to horsemanship. Here's where TCU really shines. They would probably get 5-0 if they're going up against Texas A&M. But if they're going up against Georgia, I think that would be 4-1 for TCU. And in reining, I think that would go 3-2 for TCU if it's up against A&M and 3-1 if it's up against Georgia. I know it's a little confusing the way I just said all that, but basically, if Texas A&M is in this meet, we're looking at a final score of 12-7 for TCU over Texas A&M. But if Georgia is in this meet, the final score would either be 10-9 in favor of TCU or maybe even 10-9 in favor of Georgia, just depending on how fences goes. So yeah, if Georgia can get past A&M in round 1, I think they match up really well against TCU. Now, if you'll recall, Georgia and TCU did face off in the neutral site meet back in the fall. TCU did win that, but keep in mind, that was a 4-on-4 meet. When you add in those 4 extra riders, that might be enough for Georgia to get the win. But again, they've got to get past Texas A&M in the first round. So over we go to semifinal number 2. The stats suggest that this is going to be Auburn versus SMU, but it could just as likely be Oklahoma State and SMU. Here's what the stats suggest if SMU's opponent is Auburn. I think fences would go 4-1 for Auburn. I think flat would go 3-1 for SMU. I think horsemanship goes 3-2 for Auburn. And I think reining goes 2-2 for both teams. Add that up, and I think Auburn would upset SMU 10-8. If Oklahoma State makes this semifinal, I think things go differently. I think fences goes 2-2 for both teams. I think flat goes 3-2 for SMU. I think horsemanship goes 3-1 for SMU. And I think reining goes 3-2 for SMU. So that would give us a, I don't know, I don't have it all calculated, but that would give us an SMU win over the Cowgirls. So in this very evenly matched tournament, we have several likely championship scenarios. The one that I think is the most likely is Auburn versus TCU. If that happens, I think fences goes 4-1 for Auburn. I think flat goes 3-2 for TCU. I think horsemanship goes 3-1 for TCU. and I think reigning goes 3-2 for TCU. That would mean a 10-9 win for TCU. But this could just as easily be Auburn versus Georgia. If that happens, the stats suggest that fences would go 3-2 for Auburn, flat would go 3-1 for Georgia, horsemanship would go 4-1 for Auburn, and reigning would go 2-2 for both teams, giving us a final score of 10-8 in favor of Auburn. But we might just as easily get a matchup of Georgia versus SMU. If we do, the stats suggest fences would go 3-2 for Georgia, flat would go 3-2 for Georgia, horsemanship would go 3-1 for SMU, and reigning would go 3-2 for SMU. That would give us a final score of 10-9 SMU. But we might also get number 1 versus number 2, TCU versus SMU. If that happens, the stats say fences will go 3-1 for SMU, flat will go 2-2 for each team, horsemanship would go 4-1 for TCU, and reigning would go 3-2 for SMU. So all those numbers add up to a 10-8 victory for TCU. So when you look at these 4 likely scenarios, I think TCU actually matches up better against SMU than they do against Auburn. But again, there's no guarantee that TCU would get past A&M or Georgia. SMU would probably rather face Georgia or Texas A&M over TCU based on the way the stats match up. But honestly, I don't think SMU is afraid of anybody. I don't think they're thrilled that they got Auburn as their possible semifinal opponent. But again, this is the national championship, so you're going to face some tough teams. You can't miss all the good teams in a tournament like this. So anyway, of those 4 scenarios, TCU is the national champions in 2 of those. Basically because they have such a dominant horsemanship squad that they can kind of use that to sort of smooth out any problems they have in the other 3 events. In one of the scenarios, Auburn ends up national champions, and in another scenario, SMU winds up the national champions. So this kind of tracks because those are our 3 top teams, so that's kind of what we would expect. But again, we don't know exactly how everything's going to go. We will find that out this weekend. And I will be the only national media member covering the tournament live from Ocala, and I look forward to seeing everybody down there. I look forward to seeing the riders, the families. People will come up to me and tell me how I've been mispronouncing their name all along, and I'd love to hear about that and hear how you actually pronounce your name. So looking forward to all that. And until next week, that is all for this episode. I am your host, Auburn Elvis. Thank you very much for listening, and War Horses.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on the E2C Network. On your way out, I want to remind you to stop by e2cnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for all our content across our podcast, YouTube channel, and much more. To stay up to date with us, make sure you're following social media accounts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. While our content here may always be Auburn sports heavy, if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. War Eagle.